I have quite a few people to introduce now. I have, first of all, Professor Martin Mills from the University of Queensland. Then there's Glenda McGregor from Griffith University. Kitty Te Riele from Victoria University, which is not surprisingly in Victoria. And Aspa Baroutsis, who is a postdoctoral fellow at University of Queensland as well. Now this group of academics we've been in each other's orbit for quite some time, and I'm really loving the work that they're doing because there are some similarities between what they're doing with Flexi-schools and what I've been doing with Behaviour schools. And I think one of the best messages that I've heard come from their research is about, well, what can mainstream schools learn from Flexi-schools, and their use of or their respect for student voice is always a wonderful thing. So can you join me in welcoming the team? I won't say them all again, but the team from everywhere.
Thanks, Linda. So the presentation we're going to do today has grown out of a Australian Research Council Discovery grant looking at flexible schools around Australia. We begun the project by questions similar to what John has been asking. What would a socially just school look like? And we've struggled with that in terms of many of the schools that we've been to, many of the conversations we've had with young people. And we had been doing various projects, some as part of a linkage, some as part of a Ian Potter Foundation grant, ARC, and some work with Youth Affairs Network Queensland. And we've been coming in contact with Flexi-schools, I guess alternative schools, schools that are sometimes referred to in some parts of the world as second chance schools, schools that young people had come back to after they had either rejected or themselves been rejected by a mainstream school. And we thought these were really interesting young people to talk to, because these were young people who had, as I said, either been rejected by school or had themselves rejected schools, and in many cases were seen as being unteachable. And when we spoke to them in the schools that they were now in, they were talking about how much they liked school, how much they wanted to come to school. And we thought, well, there's probably some lessons we can learn from young people who have made a decision to come back into education and have found it possible to come back into education. So that's the focus of our research. What is it about these schools that make learning possible for these young people? We drew on the notion of the dictatorship of no alternative, partly because we really like the quote from Michael Fielding and Peter Moss in their book on radical schooling. And their notion of the dictatorship of no alternative is in some ways a response to the Margaret Thatcher comment in the 1980s in the UK, when she basically stated there is no alternative to the neoliberal way of operating. And what we want to suggest is, as does Michael Fielding and Peter Moss, that there are alternatives to the neoliberal project. We have to, and I have the unfortunate task of having to set the context, is that we do have to say a little bit about the context in which these schools are operating. And then Kitty and Glenda will present some of the voices of young people in the schools we've been going to. Pasi Sahlberg from Finland. I've done quite a bit of work in the State Department of Education in Queensland, and there's a saying going around the corridors of Mary Street that it's a bit like, the Faulty Towers things of not mentioning the war. Don't mention Finland again. Nobody wants to hear any more conversations about Finland. But Pasi Sahlberg, in his book Finished Lessons, raises this notion of the global education reform movement, aptly referred to as GERM. And as part of that reform movement, what you see is an absolute focus on outcomes, and we see it in NAPLAN, OPs, and so on. So an obsession with high performance based upon quite simple measures, and accountability, as you would know through the My School website, schools competing with each other, like as in a marketplace. And I've been doing quite a bit of work in England where they've constructed, these super heads or super principals who are basically entrepreneurs or who treat schools as CEOs. We see in it, and this is, Gerald Grace once talked about how teacher professionalism was a double-edged sword. You could talk about it as a way of valuing the profession, but it could also be ways to, kind of beat the profession up. And I think the focus on teacher quality at the moment as part of this global education reform movement is something that really is a double-edged sword, in that it says, teachers matter, and we know they matter, but teachers cannot be held responsible for every single problem that face students outside of school, perhaps. We then see this kind of attempt to be better than our global competitors. For instance, Julia Gillard talked when we did poorly on international tests how we need to be in the top 5 country by 2025. That bears no attention to how well other countries are doing, or quality of life, or the experiences of kids in schools. We have to admit that there have been an inclusion agenda, in the sense that we've now tried to make... There is an inclusion agenda in policy about trying to make schools more socially just, fairer. We have to admit that. But part of that has been lifting the school leaving age, as Katrina mentioned. But for some young people who are in school, having a really awful time at school, who are not, who are always under threat of suspension or expulsion, many of those young people see schools as prison. Right? Extending it to 17 years is a bit like an extended prison sentence for many of those kids. Right? So there is, in some ways, the inclusion agenda has not been great. But what we have seen as a result of this focus on outcomes, increasing young people at schools for longer periods of time, has been an increase in the need for flexi-schools, for schools outside of the mainstream, sometimes as a way of passing kids out who maybe aren't seen as being great for schools that are trying to be seen as outstanding. I've gone well over my time for introduction, sorry. So what we have seen in the flexi-schools, and this is something that came from one of the schools that we've been to, where they said that what we see as our role is to clear the path for learning, to actually create an environment where kids can come to school, and that what they need that is preventing them from engaging in learning is also taken care of, as well as the learning.
Thanks, Martin. So we're not arguing, in terms of clearing the path for learning, we're not arguing that welfare should be replacing education in schools, but rather, like one of the principals in the research put it, it's welfare for learning. And so one of the ways in which that clearing the path happens is in terms of providing enabling kind of support. So that might be around supporting a young mum with childcare, about going to court with a student, or helping them with housing. So for example, Leroy there from Key College in Sydney talks about that when he has to go to court, staff from the school come with him, they're really supportive, they really care. And he talks about this letter that one of the staff members wrote, like 2 pages about how good I was at school, and that's how they can support and they care. And you can tell they care because they don't want you to go to jail at all, they just want to see you succeed. And he went on to talk about how the judge was so impressed with that letter and so impressed with his commitment to wanting to continue his learning and his schooling, that's why he wasn't sentenced to a custodial sentence. And so that kind of support can be very powerful. Now, of course, we understand that in mainstream schools, you may not always be able to provide that kind of support yourself, but you may be able to connect young people with other agencies that provide that support. And then there's the really basic needs, food in your tummy, transport to get to school, that it's so easy to think that young people have got that covered, but so many of them don't. And so these kind of programs do talk about saying that our school is a place where they can come and get fed, and if they're not too embarrassed, they can come and have a shower, they can brush their teeth, they can get a new set of clothes, and that makes a real difference. There was a story in the newspapers in Victoria recently about a whole group of young people who have been getting fined for not having their MyKey card, their public transport card, topped up, and then they get transport fines, and they come to a legal aid centre. And they say that some of them were saying that they're not going to school because they can't afford to top up their MyKey card, and then they get fined, and so it's easier just to not go to school because they can't afford the costs. Now, that should not, transport costs should not get in the way of young people going to school. And so then, as Linda said, we've had a look at, well, what kind of things might we learn from these kind of flexible learning centres or alternative schools that ordinary high schools can learn from. And I would like to say that ultimately, the ideal, in my view, would be that we make flexible learning programs redundant, that your ordinary high school down the road caters for everyone. But we know that that doesn't happen. In Victoria, the word is that there are 10,000 young people who should be in school who aren't. And so these kind of flexi centres work with a lot of those young people. And they do that by changing the offer of education rather than trying to fix the kid. So we're going to talk about three aspects: learning programs, environment and teaching. And I'll start with learning programs. So the first one is around offering a diversity of curriculum. And the example here is about a music program that this student said has just been consistently amazing and wonderful. And that while they had their basic math and English classes, they also had a huge variety of arts subjects. And the thing there is that partly it's about choice. It's about valuing the kind of subjects that these students are interested in as real subjects, not just, an elective in hands-on learning or an elective in creative arts on the side. And it also gives these young people an opportunity to be good at something. And when you have a chance to do things you're interested in, do things that you can be good at, then that can transfer to all the other subjects, so that you're quite happy to do your math and English as well, because you've got all this other stuff going on. And Katrina talked about the idea of seeing yourself as capable. If you can do the art subject, the music or the hands-on learning, and you can be seeing yourself as capable in that, it can boost your confidence to then also go into your math and English. Then it's about the curriculum being relevant and authentic, about it being meaningful to the young person. So James here says it's more like life skills kinds of things as well. It's not about just sitting down and doing it in a book, reading it from a book kind of thing. It's teaching you how to live, I think, and that's the kind of subjects that they offer. And young people often talk about a kind of a reality test that schooling has to pass, and schooling often doesn't pass that reality test. It's not about dumbing down the curriculum. It's about trying to create some kind of connection between the reality of their lives and the curriculum in school. And so the example here from Jane about saying she's still doing her math. This is the SACE, it's the South Australian Certificate of Education. It's real curriculum, but using an applied way of helping students understand that. And I think we've heard lots of examples over the last day and a half of how lots of schools and teachers try to do that. And then the final one around learning programs is about actually achieving certificates. And this is really important to these young people. Often these are young people who haven't had a lot of experiences of being successful, who haven't been the ones getting the merit certificate at the award ceremony at the end of the year. And so they really value getting credentials. And they really value the access to better life opportunities that these credentials represent. And I can still remember talking with Maddie and her telling me that she was just so looking forward to graduating, getting that certificate underneath my belt and be proud that I actually finished something. And she was just so excited about that. That was a new experience and such a valuable experience for her.
Okay, I didn't realise how quickly that clock was ticking. The problem with going on the second day is actually that a lot of very clever people have actually preempted what we might say. But I think that's a good thing, because a lot of the things we're saying have been said before, and we've heard it yesterday, we've heard it today. John's presentation today underpins what I'm going to say. But I think that one of the problems is that there are a lot of voices saying these things, but they're not cutting through. They're not cutting through sufficiently to policymakers. And so we have to keep saying them, and we need more people to come on board. And in particular, we need to foreground the voices of the young people, such as we are presenting here today. Now, environment is critical in schooling and educational contexts. And the work that was presented yesterday from Maryland's East, we completely agree with the significance of changing the physical environment, because the physical environment reflects power structures, and we can't alter the relational environment unless we also think about that physical environment. So I just wanted to note that connection to yesterday's presentation. We have visited so many alternative flexible learning options and sites that we couldn't possibly bring you all of what we have heard and seen. So today we have a very, very short snapshot, just reflecting some of the key concepts that seem to underpin the relational environment that supports the young people who find themselves using the services of flexible centres. So if you have a look at this first slide, there are a couple of words that stand out, one of which is family, and presumably that's a nice family, not some of the ones we might, think of as being not particularly nice. So words like, there's a family context which conjures up notions of support and nurturing and caring. So there's connection to other people. Now, these elements are important for all human beings and for all children, but for young people who have been alienated from social institutions, in particular alienated from schooling institutions, forming those connections is part of the process of clearing the way for learning, as is our metaphor for today. Also, the partnerships that are then facilitated by those connections and that sense of family. So if you are going to trust staff, if you are going to allow them to guide you and help you, you need that connection to begin with. So more words here, such as agency, safety, self-direction, and again you can hear resonances from what these young people are saying with some of the presentations we've heard yesterday and today. So it's about self-efficacy, it's about self-belief. And this flows through to the pedagogy and the curriculum. The pedagogical relationships that are then made possible by the sense of family and personal connections. You can see how the path slowly opens up for these young people. And finally, the other element necessary in helping these young people to engage with the curriculum and engage with pedagogy is the way in which teaching is made flexible. Assessment expectations are modified to suit the life circumstances of these young people. So the sites are flexible and they are responding to the contexts of the young people's lives. So all of these elements, the ones Kitty spoke about, these relational factors, they form a holistic context for the young people. So I'll hand over now to Martin, who'll wrap it all up.
So we just wanted to make a couple of concluding comments. We, as we said, has been really, really impressed by young people's voices in these schools and the positivity that's been expressed about them. This is an example from one girl at one of the schools that we went to, a school that was for just girls. And she says, Jane says, I like it here, yeah. Mum's happy for me because she knew I wasn't the person who liked school and she thought I was going to become a failure. And I told her, Mum, I'm doing course now and it's a lot better than school. And she's as happy as for me. And we heard these stories over and over again. There was one where we spoke to a mother who said to us about the father in the house who had said, who's that girl living with us now that gets up in the morning to go to school, that gets up really early to go to a school that's a long way from her home compared to the local school that she used to go to. So we've heard so many positive stories, but there's two words of caution, I think, or one word of caution and then a kind of rider about terminology. We went to one of the schools we went to, the principal, and again, a school that we really, really like and enjoy going and visiting. The principal of that school said, you don't want it to be something where kids feel embarrassed to go to. You must be dumb or naughty. You want it to be an alternative education where you can come, choose the program that you need to do to get to your goal. That's the key. We're not a dumping ground. We're not here about punishment. We're about making it the choice. And I think that's really critical. And I think Jeff asked John comment this morning about would there still be a need for alternative schools if we had socially just schooling? And I think maybe the question is no. That what we are seeing are schools that are in some ways picking up the young people who have not been wanted by the mainstream and providing them with an education, and in the process kind of holding up a mirror to the mainstream saying, this is how it can be done. These young people can be taught. And maybe the jury's out on whether we need alternative schools or not, or whether all schools are so different that every school is kind of alternative from what we have as a notion of school. The last point we want to make, and we have had so many conversations about terminology, and I know John raised some problems with common terminology. One is with engagement. And you have those moments when you're kind of a bit shocked, and this happened in an interview that we were doing, where we were actually doing a project on disengagement. And we'd gone to this school that had fantastic programs, and external programs, alternative programs. And then suddenly the head teacher, very well-known head teacher in the jurisdiction where this research was taking place, suddenly got upset with us, and it was almost like started poking us in the chest, well, me in the chest. And he says, this is really important, I think, I really hate the word disengaged. Every time I get the chance, I say to people like yourself, that's the point when poked in the chest, like yourself and others, that the real word is disenfranchised. Because disengaged suggests it's the student's fault, when the reality of it usually is it's just that the education system doesn't provide anything that meets the needs of the disenfranchised. And I think that's a really important quote, because it then shifts it away from the student and says, hang on a minute, maybe we're not doing it correctly. Maybe we need to clear the path for learning. Maybe we need to think about our environment, our teaching programs and our pedagogy. And so I guess we'd like to conclude on that notion of maybe we need to think of using terms like disenfranchised rather than disengaged, and then that maybe shifts the spotlight on where change can take place. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. John Smythe.
Oh, hi, John.
I just wanted you to comment on a comment I'll make, because what you've done here is very similar to the part of the work that we've been doing about kids in re-engaging programs. Probably the wrong word, but that's the language that's used. The observation is this: how come the system that damages these kids is the same system that undamages them? Because in a sense, when you look at what you're saying and what our work has shown, it's the high school that damages these kids, but it's the same education system, albeit these alternatives, that actually is about rehabilitating these kids. How come? What's your comment on that?
Yeah. Look, it's a good question, John, and I think that in part, see, we did a paper on teachers' work in these schools, and what the teachers, and the interview data we had from the teachers indicated that teachers now said in these new environments, they could actually do the jobs that they'd become teachers to do. That in their previous schools, where they'd worked in many of them in schools unlike the ones we've heard spoken about these last 2 days, they actually felt that they were becoming people they didn't really want to become. One teacher said to us, I suddenly started finding myself yelling at kids or telling kids, because of the very way in which the discourses that operate within some of these high schools force teachers to operate in ways they don't want to operate. And I think that the environments of these alternative schools provide a space where relationships can develop differently, because I think, relationships are key, where, and I can't stand, and it just doesn't make sense to me when I hear all the arguments about class size doesn't matter. You know that every time I've seen these schools, they're in smaller classes, the kids talk about the positive relationships that they build with the teachers, how the teachers can then tailor learning to particular kids' needs and so on. So I think the structures are quite different in these alternative schools, John. I think that's why they can, I don't want to use the word fix up, because it's not about fixing up. It's where they can create a space for those kids to want to learn. I don't know if that's...
Oh, sorry.
Clearly not.
Yeah, I think you've partly answered it there. I guess I'm still scratching my head at the biggest level about the system. I don't have any problem with schools being able to do this stuff.
Oh, okay.
So it's really the question about what kind of society is it that continues to have some kids that can't fit being warehoused.
Yeah.
That's to be put the less charitable view on it, because that's really what they're put out of sight, out of mind, in which interesting things are done.
Yeah.
So I guess the question really is, how do we begin to make what is the margins the mainstream? I mean, how do we do that? How do we begin to reinvent this appalling thing called the high school?
Yeah.
I think that's the question that we are attempting to answer by building up a body of knowledge that we can feed back to the mainstream. But I think from a number of presentations over the last day or so from schools that are changing their structures, I think that there is hope for the system, but it needs more leadership, more principles of courage to do the kinds of things that MEPS was doing, for example. So I think there are little signs of hope, but making huge systemic changes is something that's probably a long-term project.
And a few years ago in New South Wales, the government put out a report that has as a subtitle, One Size Does Not Fit All. And in some ways, these alternative or flexible schools that we work with are, a different size. But I also think you have to be very, very careful about binaries. It's not as if there is an alternative school system and a mainstream school system. There's such diversity within what we quickly just call mainstream schools, and we've heard so many stories here over the last day and a half. And there's huge diversity also within the flexible and alternative schools that we look at. And so maybe it is that kind of, letting a variety of flowers bloom within whatever the system might be.
Can I just add that I think that, and I think we've all spoken about this in the past, is that whilst that we're looking at the kids who have rejected or been rejected by mainstream schools. There's a whole range of other kids that just tolerate schools, that in some ways are just going through the motions of schooling. So I do think that the lessons we're learning about schools for young people who have been disenfranchised also have great relevance for those people, for all young people in schools. Yeah. Are we being wound up? Yep. Okay. So, thank you.